Genna, I was thinking about it earlier, and I think you and I have known each other almost 20 years. I think beginning with Medfin, and since that time, we've followed many different paths between us, but we've remained pretty connected, and at the same time, pretty immersed in the dental space and in the community. I guess before we get stuck into talking about career highlights and stuff, I'd love to know your background and to let everybody know what it is.
Sure, Stafford. My parents were Russian post-war immigrants from China. It was my grandparents that left Russia during and just after the revolution, which was 1917. They both families actually moved to Manchuria, which was across the border from Siberia. And my parents were both born in Manchuria and left China after the Second World War when the Nationalist Party came to power and asked most foreigners to leave. I was born in Australia, educated in Australia, and I think the benefit of that, having a bicultural background, is it helped me understand the vast majority of Australians that are either born overseas or their parents are born overseas. At one point, I was employing a lot of overseas dentists, and helping them to assimilate into Australian community was something that I really enjoyed because I understand that process myself personally. My parents struggled to understand why Australians did things and how they did them. I remember them sitting around at the dinner table saying, why do Australians do this? Why do they do that? Why do they say this? What do they mean? My mother at one stage said to me, all Australian men are called Mike. I said, what do you mean they're called Mike? She said, well, listen to them. They say, g'day, Mike. What are you doing, Mike? Can you give me this, Mike? Can you help me, Mike? It took for a long time to understand that they were saying mate. And I think that is the Australian experience, is that we're a country of immigrants.
Yeah. Well, look, I obviously am also, but I'm also 20 years and my kids are, they're Australians through and through. But, for me, it's coming up to half my life that I've kind of lived here. So I feel pretty Australian too, but I think we're lucky that we've got so many different backgrounds and different cultures. But for you, what led you into dentistry?
I knew when I was in high school that I wanted to get an education that would also give me a business opportunity. I was interested in being entrepreneurial. That was part of my background. My grandfather had started a business in China. He'd started a clothes making business. He'd imported wool from Australia. Actually, that's why the family had survived during the Second World War. And it's part of my DNA to be an entrepreneur. My parents didn't get an education because of the Depression and the Second World War. They came to Australia. It was our opportunity to take advantage of. And so I wanted to get that education, but I wanted to be in business as well. And, the professions that I was interested in were, medicine, dentistry, didn't do enough well in maths to do engineering or accounting. And teaching wasn't one of them. And I didn't know enough about law to actually do it. But out of my 14 cousins, all 14 ended up getting a university degree, and the 3 of them were solicitors, one's a barrister. So, the younger cousins did it. I was number 4 out of 14 cousins, and my parents didn't get an education, so we had no idea what we were good at. So we just had to go at a whole range of professions. Subsequent generations have got a better idea of what skills we have in the family, but that was the start that we had in Australia. And I'm very pleased with that because dentistry has given me opportunities. I've left dentistry, I've come back to dentistry, I've picked it up very quickly, I've kept my registration, I still do, and I'm very grateful for that opportunity that dentistry has given me.
Yeah. Look, I think you may have been somewhat of an early adopter of, having an eclectic background as well as dentistry, but I see more and more younger dentists, they want to be more than just dentists. They feel like they're more than just a dentist or just a doctor. They've got lots of backgrounds and musicians and flexible working, etc. So I guess we would almost think of you as a bit of a pioneer, having done so many different things.
Well, in my generation, you graduated, went to work for a dentist, bought into a practice and finally retired there 40 years later. And that just wasn't for me. I'm probably more of the millennial / generation where they do one thing and then they do another thing and another thing. And I see myself as a Renaissance man. I'm multi-talented and I want to be able to use those talents, and just doing clinical dentistry is a large part of it, but it's not all of who I am.
Yeah. I remember once upon a time you told me about being the only dentist in the Pacific Islands, which is something probably most dentists in metro cities like Sydney, Melbourne, they could only dream of being the only dentist. But probably, you know, you had a different experience being the only dentist. Can you like give us a bit of background on that?
I finished dentistry, worked in Parramatta for 2 years, and a close friend of mine finished medicine and had got a position as medical director of a very remote hospital on a very remote island. It was an island of Malaita, which is on the outskirts of Solomon Islands, and the hospital there was very isolated. It had no roads to it. You can only walk into it. They eventually did build an airstrip, and there was a wharf, so you could arrive by boat or by plane. And he came over and he said, look, come over. There's 50,000 people live on this island. It's 50 kilometres long, 25 wide. There's no dentists at all. When we went over there, what I didn't realise is they were in the Stone Age back then. This was in the late 70s. There was no electricity. There was no cars. You walked from village to village. So I took with me 1,000 cartridges of local anaesthetic. I took an extraction kit. I took a drill with some couplings. And occasionally I would find a little compressor that I could use, but mostly I would line up the kids. We'd have a class at a time. We'd line them up underneath a big tree on a seat. You know, I'd do an exam on 10. I'd give locals to whoever needed a local. I'd do 5 or 6 extractions, and it was like public entertainment. People were hanging out of the trees and cheering when I got a difficult tooth out. It was different dentistry to what I've ever experienced, and I became very good at extractions as that. Luckily for me, the Solomon Islanders have got soft bone and short roots, so I didn't break very many teeth. There's only 1 or 2 out of several hundred people that I treated, but it was as primitive dentistry as you could possibly imagine. And I think that I enjoyed being thrown in the deep end and challenging myself, working out how to treat the people, how to maintain a certain level of sterility, even if it was with cold water, and how to do and how to do a lot of population in a day, because we'd walk into a village carrying all our stuff and have to walk out that night. It was exciting and primitive, and I think at the time I didn't realise just how special that experience was. But I have gone back to the Solomon Islands in recent years. This hospital is still very isolated, and there's some very isolated villages, but they've come in leaps and bounds as far as the dental facilities are concerned and the services available to them. But that was a very special time in our lives.
Yeah. Look, I mean, we definitely see more and more medical practitioners, dentists, etc., heading off into underdeveloped countries, etc., and doing a lot of good charitable work, and I suppose they have the same experience.
Yes, it's fabulous to be able to contribute to a third world country. It's really important to do it on their terms and to acknowledge their culture and their strengths. And I think that it's an eye-opener for us Westerners to actually do that, because these people have got, how can I put it, they've got cultural richness and social richness, which we may have lost a bit.
Yeah. Yeah. And where else has dentist taken you globally?
Look, after we were in the Solomons, we went to the States, travelled around the States for a while. Then I got a job at Trinidad General Hospital. So I worked in Trinidad in the Caribbean. We're there for Carnival, which was the best time to be there. It was a lot of fun. They gave us a house and a car. I think I was only earning $100 a week, but it was worthwhile being there for that 3 months.
Did you dress up for Carnival?
We stopped for Carnival. It's very raucous. The music is phenomenal. The drinking is huge, and it's a different lifestyle to what I'd ever imagined in Australia. It was a delight to be there.
How was the dentistry, relative to the Pacific Islands, for example?
Well, the hospital was reasonably well set up, so that we had clinics. People came to the clinic. There was a couple of American dentists there that had just finished dentistry, and I compared notes with them. My qualifications, matched theirs easily. And it was, the dentistry was a lot of relief of pain. There wasn't anything complex that was going on. But the same as in the Solomons. In the Solomons, when I went up into the foothills, people who lived on indigenous diets had no decay whatsoever. It was only the people who lived on the coast that had access to biscuits and Western food that had decay and needed treatment. And the same with the same with Trinidad. People who lived inland and lived on native diets had just no decay at all. It was the sugar that made the difference.
Wow. Mm. And so then ultimately you obviously landed yourself back in Australia, you were lucky enough or clever enough to set up a thriving practice in the Central Coast and then the Hunter Valley. So you've obviously set up practices. Like, in your mind, what are the 5 things, if you see, a colleague at a dental party or like at a cocktail party, what are the 5 things you tell them that they need to know?
There's actually 6, if I can run through them. The first one, I think it's really important to get 3 to 5 years experience in general practice, and maybe in a variety of practices, like I had the opportunity to do so. Work in Sydney for a couple of years, work overseas, work with different practitioners, different equipment, different methods, because you taught one thing at uni, but there's a number of ways of approaching it, and you need to feel confident with that variety of clinical ways, because you'll be faced with a variety of clinical issues as a dentist. And the more comfortable you are with that, the more better prepared you are for your own practice. When it comes to actually choosing a location, I found the most important thing there is having a location which has got high visibility, so people can see your practice, and market it in a way which does more than just give you your phone number. You want to have space so that your signage is there, and maybe that's a topic for another conversation, but that marketing is really important for people to get a feel for who you are and what sort of quality of dentistry you're providing through your signage, because that's the only opportunity you have sometimes.
I feel like I feel like you're a bit of a pioneer of the kind of big visual images, the big Photoshop images.
Yes, that's exactly what I'm referring to. Big images that you can see half a kilometre away of a smiling family is more important than a list of services that you offer, a shopping list of services.
Yeah.
So location is really important. That's the location. You want to look at a growth area, because in a growth area, people are coming in and your practice will grow a lot faster in an area where there's new families coming in, they're looking for local services, and you're going to be one of the people that are going to provide that, and you'll grow with the community. I would also suggest that you need to have an accountant that's got your finances up to date, because when you're going to go to Credible and ask for finances, the first thing they're going to say is, are your tax returns done? Have you got a business plan? What are your finances like? And the last thing I would suggest is that you do some practice management courses, because part of owning a practice is managing staff, managing other dentists, managing all the business needs that you have, and they don't touch on that at university at all. They just do the clinical work, and yet you've got to run a business. There's a business side to it. So the 6 things that I'm saying is wait 5 years, get a location with exposure, develop in a growth area, make sure your finances are in place, and do some practice management courses.
Yeah. I think, we're finding a lot that, that saying in residential property where they say, you rent where you want to live, but you buy where you think it's a good investment. And I think we find that with people, we're saying to them, when you think about setting up a practice, think not about how close it is to home or anything like that. Think about where it'll be successful. Think about where you'll thrive, where there's a lot of population growth, and live where you want, but, maybe be prepared to travel to where you'll build a really successful business.
I think that's the case. I live on the North Shore, and I practiced in Newcastle for quite a while. You've got to go where where the opportunities are.
Yeah, and that's a couple of hour trip. That's the extreme, I suppose. But yeah, I think you're right. You've got to go where the demand is.
Well, at one stage I was working in Glebe, and it took me longer to get to Glebe in the morning than it did to Warners Bay in Newcastle. It was an hour and a quarter, no stops on the expressway, whereas it was an hour and a half from Pymble to Glebe in peak hour.
Yeah, it's probably no different today. Although maybe COVID has changed the dynamic a little bit, it could be a bit quicker.
Yes.
And so then, how on earth? Obviously it's got the same surname, but how on earth did you end up with Levitch Designs? And then how did that cross over with the work that you did at Pacific Smiles Group?
Look, that's a complex question, and let me give you a very brief overview. I'm extremely fortunate to be married to a beautiful, talented, and hardworking woman who's got phenomenal design skills. She started designing dental practices back in the mid-90s. She'd worked with me as a dental nurse, and for her, so she knew what her husband would do. And she also did her final year thesis was ergonomics in the dental surgery. So she had very good background to it. So when a friend of ours said to her, look, you're doing all these shops and that you're designing, can you design a dental surgery for me? It worked out really well. And so the business gradually grew. So that was running on the side in the late 90s, running from home. At the same time, I had bought into a practice in Warners Bay, and there was 5 dentists in a loose partnership. We had 5 practices between us. Alex Abrahams was one of them, and we used to sit and talk for a long time about how we could move from a partnership structure, because that's what was allowed in those days, to a corporate structure, so we could grow in a way that a company can grow. It's very hard for a partnership to grow. So the law changed in '98, and we then sold our practices into a company. 3 of the dentists, myself, Alex and Alison Hughes, wanted to do that. 2 of the other dentists were very concerned about this move and decided not to. That was okay. They were left with a practice of their own. But the 3 of us then put our practices into this company, and it was Pacific Smiles Group. That's how it started. So I was one of the founders of Pacific Smiles, and worked with, I was a founding shareholder, founding director, and I really enjoyed working with that, because that was the entrepreneurial side of me that I really loved. And this was a rare opportunity. In my view, it was a multi-generational opportunity, because the law had changed and allowed a different structure, and the structure could then grow indefinitely, whereas you can't do it with a partnership because it's very limited in what you can do. So I stayed with Pacific Smiles for about 7 years. Anne's business grew, and Anne and I had always wanted to work together, so I made the decision finally to work exclusively with Levitch Design, but we still designed a lot of the practices, the early practices for Pacific Smiles. Pacific Smiles went from 3 practices to 17 in the first 3 or 4 years. It's now got 94 practices, and it's still going from strength to strength. Working with Anne in Levitch Design Associates enabled me then to provide a service to dentists, and we worked with maybe 350, 400 dentists around Australia, designing and then building practices as well. And it was during that time that I started working with you, because one of the bottlenecks in a practice is getting the finances right. And I met you and started working with you. At the time, if you remember, Stafford, there was not a lot of spreadsheets, and Excel had just come into being, and we developed some spreadsheets to give us a feasibility on how a practice would do, what sort of income they needed to pay for their loans, what sort of growth would be expected in the first few years. And I've still got that still is the core of my feasibilities that I do for dentists who still want a hand to do things. But I remember that you provided a lot of the background banking figures of what a bank would expect, and that's what started our relationship, and it's grown from there. Yeah. So, just to answer your question though, they were complex years in the early 2000s, and I really enjoyed seeing Pacific Smiles grow and Levitch Design grow as well. There was a bit of a time conflict for me, as I couldn't be involved in both, but it was a lot of fun, and it was very rewarding time for me. Yeah,
it's strange for me to think about the fact that it was one of the first things that I did on Excel. Like, that's how long ago it was. Or it feels like it anyway. But I mean, like, you've obviously seen so many different sides of dentistry and the profession. Like, you've been involved in corporate, you've been a designer, you've been a practitioner, but it sounds like there's a bit of a common thread in everything you've done around understanding consumer psychology. So, like, what's your advice for a young dentist starting out, spent a long time qualifying, but got a bit more of an appetite for the business side of the profession?
Look, it is a very big topic. Let me just talk on one small aspect of it. When we were doing, Levitch Design was doing corporate branding for a practice, doing a logo for them, putting together a choice of names, which they could call themselves, doing all their marketing for them. One of the things I noticed was that the dentists would often go to their mates, to their colleagues, and say, what do you think of this? Because they're concerned about breaking any ethical boundaries. And so if they're getting the okay from their mates, they kind of feel comfortable with it. And I don't think that's the right approach. I think you need to get a graphic designer, you need to get a marketer, you need to get the view of what the general public responds to, rather than what the rest of the profession responds to. And because we look at dentistry, because we've got our qualifications, we've got the letters after our name, we look at our clinical skills, and the general public doesn't understand any of that at all. So if you can change your point of view from looking at your practice as a dentist to looking at your practice as a general public, you will see something completely different, and it will enable you to market in a way in which people actually understand what it is that you're saying and feel comfortable in coming to see you. The whole purpose of marketing is to reduce the barriers to apprehension. once people come in their door and see you and see what a lovely guy you are, they're going to stay. It's getting them through the door that was what it's all about. And you don't have to sell your dentistry to get people through the door. You just need to make it comfortable for people to come in.
Yeah. Look, I think it's one of the things our team can obviously, being very focused only on these professions, can give the insight into what peers are doing in the space. But, you know, it's only, I think you're right, it's only one part of it. I think it's good to understand what peers are doing. But, you know, we're always saying, and we're working with so many industry and professional participants, and we're saying you need to assemble a good team. And, you know, that's multiple people. You know, these are fairly big businesses. They're significant businesses that people build these days. You know, they're not little shingles, you know, one chair practices, etc. They're much more significant and substantial businesses, you know, professional looking and marketing and keeping up with the competition. So, you know, I 100% agree. Like, you've got to assemble a good team.
The team is what it's all about. And if you're starting a practice and you're wanting to make a practice which has an impact on the general public and people talk about it, then you need to have a designer and a construction team that understands your vision, because you can't do it all yourself. You know, you can't, you know, be a clinician and a designer and a marketer and a graphic designer. You've got to have a team behind you. And that's something that probably I didn't realise early in my working life, where I tried to be all things to all people. But I've realised, you know, once I was an LDA, that putting the team together is what it's all about. And sometimes the team would involve 50, 60 people when you're doing a large project, and you've got to manage the team to get the best out of it. And that's a particular skill that not every dentist has, because we're used to working on our own, making our own decisions in our surgery. And this is a completely different mindset.
Yeah.
Well,
I mean, thank you so much for, you know, sharing some of your insights today. It's been great. And so, like, really thanks on Credible's behalf for giving us your time.
It's a pleasure, Stafford. I've really enjoyed talking to you. And the reason I've come on to do this interview is because I understand how crucial finances are. It's one of the bottlenecks in practice growth, and I appreciate the services that you provided to the dental and medical community. And thank you for the opportunity.
Likewise. Well, thanks everybody for joining us today. I hope that you got something out of it. You know, it's always good if you can take away a pearl or two. And obviously, if either Genna or myself can help you, then we're always available.
Surely are.
Thanks.
Thank you. Bye-bye.